Namaste everyone. Welcome to another episode of Indic Studies Toronto. Today our topic is India in Egypt, Antiquity of Indian Civilization. Our speaker today is Dr. Tilak Ranjan Bera, who has explored Indian subcontinent over 20 years to collect ground evidences to arrange pre-recorded period of India. He is a Fulbright Fellow and was in Yale University, USA during his fellowship. Namaste, Dr. Tilak. Please continue.
Namaskar, everybody. I'm grateful to Indic Studies Toronto for giving me this opportunity to discuss about the pre-recorded period of India and that of the world. At this stage, we are not very clear about the antiquity of the Indian civilization. We consider that Indian civilization is one of the oldest civilizations of the world, if not the oldest. But we have failed so far to actually quantify exactly how old is this civilization. Now, I personally feel that we need a multidiscipline study and a scientific approach to study this subject. Uh, we have to compile information from many subjects and from many sources to arrange that. And firstly, what we have to do is to arrange the direction of the migration, post-glacial period migration of the human fraternities. Who traveled from which place to which place in the last 10, 15,000 years? And do we have any evidence to establish that? So our subject is though the subject is India, the title is India in Egypt, we will be discussing. The aim is to establish the antiquity of the Indian civilization. I have authored a book titled India in Egypt. And today we will be discussing about the contents of this book in this presentation. As the name suggests, it is all about an intense connectivity between the Indian and the Egyptian civilization. In fact, I'm making an effort to establish that Egyptian civilization was established by the Indian origin people. It is possible that in the meantime, the British education system, which continued in India for over 200 years, established our history in a manner which suited them. So Indian history got distorted. And in fact, they managed to establish that Indo-Europeans have come from the West and they established civilization in India. So whatever we are saying, what we are saying that no Indian people had traveled from here to the Mediterranean region may appear unbelievable at this stage. However, and they went from India to the Mediterranean region to Egypt and established other civilizations may appear unbelievable at this stage. But we have to keep in mind that this is why it is unbelievable, because in our academic curriculum, whatever we have been taught does not encourage such a line of thinking. But we have to keep in mind that what we have been taught may not be correct in every sense. Evidences suggest that Indian origin people at a very early period, basically during post-glacial period or about 10 to 12,000 years ago, had traveled from India to the Mediterranean region and established other ancient civilizations. We will show the migration path. We will establish on what basis we are saying this, and that the migration was from east to west. And let us make an attempt to understand the available evidences in India and also in the Mediterranean region and try to explain all those evidences in a scientific manner. At this stage, we are trying to answer everything by taking a single subject approach. The anthropologist is working as per his syllabus, that is whatever their approach is little different from the archaeologist, and that their approach is different from geneticist. This single subject approach has its own limitation. For example, historians and archaeologists are possibly not keeping or are not aware of the genetic composition of the global population to that extent to understand that if a particular genetic identity has migrated from place A to place B of one continent to the other, how to correlate that. They're not even trying to correlate because they're not aware that genetic uh, such genetic connectivity or such genetic migration from one place to other places is actually exist, does actually exist. So, and moreover, history is only 2,500 years old in case of India. If we start taking, I mean, if we go from Ashoka Edict as the written history, as the start of written history, whereas the available archaeological data presently available about, let us say, Rakhigadi, uh, Virana, Mehergarh, Lahura Deva, Gulf of Combat Cultural Complex clearly established that Indian civilization is at least 10,000 years old. So this period from 2,500 years to 10,000 years remains unrecorded and so least discussed because anything which is recorded, all the 99% of the discussion we do or seminars we attend are based on written portion. That is, it is written here like this and that. Whereas there are so many other evidences which are scattered all over the subcontinent, which are not considered because that does not form part of the written history. So I decided to go for a multidisciplinary approach as far as possible for a single individual. So I collected information from all possible subjects and including all possible scientific subjects and compiled them in my book. And basically, we have to, I have collected information from anthropology, archaeology, language, culture, genetics, and even ancient texts like Rig Veda. We have to arrange the events since the arrival of the anatomical modern human in India 65,000 years ago. Evidences of each period of the development of the Indian civilization is well preserved in some form or other in some part of India. Genetics definitely provides us a very specific data about the origin of a particular fraternity and their exact location of origin and their period of origin and their migration from one continent to the other. This is a very popular genetic map of R1 Bravo haplogroup. This is a post-glacial period genetic identity which had spread all over the world. So we will try to discuss this a little more. That this provides us that that different part of the world. I mean, some migration had taken place at some stage. There is no doubt about it. Now that we are finding a particular genetic uh, foci or about a location where a particular genetic identity is a focal point is there, and the same genetic identity is there in some other part of the world, we have to accept that some migration had taken place at some stage. I think we have the responsibility, though this genetic data has been created or generated by the Western scholars, it is we have to provide them further information about what we have in different part of India as ground evidence for them to include that in their consideration of arranging the migration path. And particularly the information which has been published regarding archaeology and genetics in the last 2 to 3 decades about Indian population. We have to discuss that and give them our ideas or our inputs, which probably they are not considering. As an example, I can say that in fact, when we arrange that, our the narrative of Indian history or the history of the pre-recorded period of India completely changes. I can give you an example like Professor Suniti Kumar Chatterjee wrote a book, India and Ethiopia, because he found that Ethiopia has got a lot of Sanskrit words in their text and in their historical records. A lot of names were Sanskrit names. Now that was a puzzle. That book he wrote 50 years back. So he confirmed that there is a linguistic connectivity or cultural connectivity. Why the names are Sanskrit in nature is because there some fraternity had traveled from place A to place B. Now, this genetic map provides a scientific explanation of that linguistic puzzle, that R1 Bravo indeed is present in India and R1 Bravo is present in Ethiopia. So possibly an R1 Bravo fraternity had traveled from place A to place B. Now the question is whether that migration was from east to west or from west to east. That we have to settle on the basis of other uh, evidences, cultural evidence, linguism. In any case, once geneticists are, I mean, considers this, there's a possibility that there was a migration from the genetic identity of two fraternity, they can actually establish which is older. Another example is very recently, there are some studies that there is a connectivity between the Bengali language and French language. Now you see, Bengal is located east of the eastern subcontinent and France is located west of Europe, Western Europe. Now, this is another linguistic puzzle, not only language. In fact, there is some similarity in the cultural characteristic of Bengal and France. Now, again, this genetic map provides that answer that R1 Bravo, there is a connectivity between R1 Bravo of Bengal and R1 Bravo of France. Today, more concentration of R1 Bravo is there in France, but that does not mean it originated there. So now we will be discussing all these on the basis of ground evidences that what is the likely possibility, and then it is open to the scholars to accept or discard. Presently, we consider that India is the melting pot. That is, people have come from different directions. That is, Indo-Aryans have come from the West, or more specifically from Europe, with their Indo-European language, whereas the Tibeto-Burman speakers and Austroasiatics have come from the East. Whereas ground evidences suggest that India was actually having anatomical modern human for the last 65,000 years. So where is the need for other people to come here? Rather, from here, people have traveled to distant lands periodically during favorable condition. Basically, during glacial and interglacial period, some part of the world becomes unsuitable for human habitation and some part becomes suitable for I mean, some part remains suitable even during glacial period. That we have to keep in mind. Now, so this India is a melting pot and everybody has come from different direction is applicable only when we consider that consider the events of the last 2 to 3,000 years or 2 to 4,000 years when Indian origin people were coming back to India. By my definition, that was actually the reverse migration of Indian origin people. Whereas 10 to 12,000 years ago, Indian origin people had traveled to distant lands prior to that. And their return is recorded, and that is known as Indo-Aryan invasion, and that is why India is considered as a melting pot. So we have to understand that we are anatomical modern human, and anatomical modern human originated in Africa about 2 lakh years ago. I mean, before that it was anatomical modern humans, Homo sapiens, and before that it was Homo erectus, and there were other genetic identities of human evolution. Last, it was anatomical modern human, and we came out of Africa about 65. Probably there were other moves out of Africa also, but the people who came out 65,000 years ago have actually survived. Now, there is a little variation amongst in different paper regarding the exact period, but roughly we can take it 65,000 years. And after they came out of Africa, they traveled along the coast. This is known as Great Coastal Migration. So India received a fraternity from Africa 65,000 years ago following their Great Coastal Migration, an out of Africa move and Great Coastal Migration. We do have pre-glacial period population well settled in Andamans. In fact, there are 4 tribes: Charawas, Onges, Sentinelese, and Great Andamans. Now, recent genetic study has confirmed that they belong to 2 genetic identities, M31 mtDNA haplogroup and M32 mtDNA haplogroup. It appears that they managed to reach from mainland India during 2 consecutive glacial periods. Now, we will discuss what is glacial period. So they managed to reach there only during glacial period that Andaman gets physically connected. Now we see these Andaman tribes in Andaman. This is a ground evidence, but we do not even bother to discuss who are these people and how did they reach there. Because, because this is not discussed in any of the syllabus. How did they reach there? Whereas we can see that they are there. There are four. And now the genetic study says that they actually belong to two genetic identities. And one of them is actually not available in India. That is M32 mtDNA haplogroup, whereas the other one is actually present in the mainland Europe. That confirms that India served as the intermediate host for the anatomical modern human after they came out of Africa. So, and then there's another observation that in central India, we find dark complexion tribes, a number of dark complexion tribes south of India Parbat. Now, we do not give a thought that why they are not there. These dark complexion tribes are not there in northern India. Why they are not there in northeastern India? Northeastern India is full of tribes, but none of them are dark complexion tribes. Now, these dark complexion tribes are possibly a very unique genetic identity or unique people of a different period. I personally think either they belong to the pre-glacial period or they belong to the early post-glacial period. And because they are different from the rest of the post-glacial period population, their genetic identity was different, and thus they were identified as ancestral South Indian in a recent genetic study. Andaman tribes are definitely pre-glacial period population. And then we have to discuss about that. Where did this post-glacial period genetic identity originated? Now, thus my concept, and they have to originate very close to the Andaman, because post-glacial period the genetic identity has to originate in a place close to where the pre-glacial period population lived. And we have genuine evidence that post pre-glacial period genetic identities like Jarawa sentinelis are still living in Myanmar. So these territory and these events of the pre and post glacial period we have to understand to claim that India is the most likely place for the origin of the post glacial period genetic identities. Now, when we compile all this, then the narrative of the migration of the post-glacial period fraternities all over the Eurasia or all over the world completely changes. Now we see that during post-glacial period, probably as they originated in the Bengal Myanmar coast, they had to, and which got submerged, they had to migrate, and they migrated to distant lands and managed to reach the Mediterranean region and Red Sea region and established other ancient civilizations. It took me 20 years of extensive exploration of the Indian subcontinent to collect ground evidences from every corner, because I believe that we must have evidence to claim whatever we are approaching. So I had to first collect evidences and then arrange them in a scientific manner so that it becomes acceptable to the global community. Now, I have written books. I explored the awkward territories or rather remote territories of India about which informations are not easily available, like Ladakh, that is Upper Indus Valley. The migration had taken place along Indus. So I had to particularly cover Upper Indus Valley, and then Northeast India, another gold mine. Unless we really understand what has happened there, it is very difficult for us to really understand the antiquity of the Indian civilization. Then pre-Portuguese Goa, Andamans, Nicobars. I've written books only about those regions which are not very well documented. Then I realized that apart from so-called Indian territory, we have to go beyond. Like in Nepal, I have to make several trips to Nepal to understand what are the evidences present along different valley or in different valley along different rivers, because majority of the migration had taken place uh, along various Himalayan rivers, and this migration is actually trans-Himalayan migration pivoting Mount Kailash. So I had to explore Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka for a compilation of my data. As I explored Northeast India, I realized that India had an intense connectivity with the Mediterranean region and the Red Sea region. In a 6th century Dahoparvati, I'm not from Assam, but in a 6th century Dahoparvatiya temple in Tejpur, Assam, archaeologists confirmed that there is Hellenistic art, that is ancient Greek art. Now, the historians are not talking about any connectivity of Assam in 6th century with Greece. Then in 13th century, Ahums constructed ancestral memorials, which again, the archaeologists confirm that these are structurally and functionally very similar to the pyramids of Egypt. Again, now this first one was from Mediterranean region, second one is from Red Sea region. And finally, I mean, when I was exploring Mizoram, I came to know that Israel has given visa to thousands of Mizos because they have confirmed that actually Mizos are one of the lost tribe of Israel. And I'm sure they have conducted genetic studies before giving visas to thousands of Mizos. Again, we got a connectivity from this place to that place by a very modern country and after a very modern test, that is genetic confirmation. Actually, I discussed this when I visited Israel also with them. So all these prompted me to travel to Egypt. Definitely, we have to understand what is there at that end. And I found so much of evidence, that I authored this book where I clearly established that Egyptian civilization was established by the Indian origin. If you notice the cover picture of the book, that I'm saying that Sphinx is nothing but Durga. Actually, and the Durga is also inseparably associated with lion, and so is Sphinx. In Indian art, we keep the deity separate and the Vahun or the animal species distinct, whereas in Egypt, there is a tendency of blending that two. So we have to, again, when I went to Greece and Turkey, we found Sphinx there. So this concept is actually artistically presented in a different manner, which we have to decipher. Now, to arrange these events, I had to introduce a number of new subjects. Unfortunately, many of them are there in front of us, but somehow we are not discussing them. So I had to I had to introduce a number of new subjects. That is, how did Andaman got connected with the mainland? So there we had to discuss about the glacial and interglacial period, rising and lowering of the seawater level. Then we had to discuss about the formation of a huge landmass between Bengal and Andaman, connecting these two territories, along which the Andaman fraternities physically entered there. Then not only this landmass formed between Bengal and Myanmar region, it actually submerged also, displacing the settled population there. That prompted the migration of fraternities, because when that was a huge territory between, you can imagine the area of that landmass when it is actually physically getting connected with Andaman. It was a huge territory and a huge population was settled there, and which got displaced as it submerged. And then when they were a mixed fraternity, and when they migrated, they adopted various animal symbols as their ethnic identity. So we get this animal symbol, and this is a global language. And then I'm discussing that the migration was along Trans-Himalayan. This was essentially, there were other routes as well, directly Narmada route also, but Trans-Himalayan migration was one of the major migration route, pivoting Mount Kailash. I had to physically explore these regions. That is, I have trekked along many of the Himalayan rivers to find ground evidences. What are the evidences on which I can say that actually the migration had taken place along this river? Then spread of matriarchal culture. We see that a matriarchal culture had spread in all the ancient civilizations at the early stage. And we find the goddesses originated in almost all the ancient civilizations at the early stage. So that I personally feel that matriarchal culture actually went from India. And then temporary and permanent settlement zones of India, that is, some part of the world and also some part of India becomes unsuitable during glacial period for human habitation. And that is why the dark complexion tribes are not there all over India. Then finally comes the evidences regarding reverse migration by land and sea route, reverse migration from Egypt and Europe. And it is not possible to discuss. I have discussed all these points quite elaborately in the book, but it is not possible to discuss here in this short video. So I'm showing you a video to explain how I am approaching this subject.
Though Indian civilization is discussed along with other ancient civilizations of the world, like the Sumerian, Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek civilizations, it could be much older than the rest. Presently, the Indian civilization is considered 5,000 years old, and its origin is explained late with the Indo-Aryan migration. Discovery of several newer archaeological sites suggests that this civilization is at least 10,000 years old. It is also possible that the Indian civilization played the role of a mother in the origin of other ancient civilizations. AMH, or anatomically modern humans, scientifically known as Homo sapiens sapiens, originated in Africa about 2 lakh years ago. They arrived in India tentatively 65,000 years ago. The presence of a large number of dark complexion tribes in India suggests the continuous survival of AMH here. Though AMH reached Europe and Northern Asia during every interglacial period, they could not survive there during the severe weather of glacial maximum and became extinct. Present population has reached there from India during the last interglacial period, 10,000 years ago. During glacial period, a huge coastal landmass surfaces between the Bengal and Myanmar coast. At this time, the population of two distinct genetic territories, the Bengal coast and Southeast Asia, intermix, producing newer genetic identities like R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroup in Y chromosome. As the seawater gradually rises during the interglacial period, this coastal landmass submerges, displacing the settled population. They settled on the Bengal coast and adopted various animal symbols as their ethnic identity. The naga, tiger, lion, elephant, fish, turtle, avian, primate, each animal symbol seen at various archaeological sites represented an Indian origin human fraternity. They eventually migrated following the Trans-Himalayan migration routes which bifurcated from Mount Kailash. About 10,000 years ago, R1 Bravo fraternity descended from Kailash and followed the Makran coast to reach Africa, where the Egyptian civilization developed. The Indus Valley civilization emerged on this route. Similarly, about 5,800 years ago, R1 Alpha fraternity migrated to Europe along with the spoken Sanskrit language. The migration path of the Bagh fraternity can be traced from Bagdogra in North Bengal, ascending along the Bagmati river and reaching the Baglum Kali temple in Nepal, and finally Baghdad in Mesopotamia across Mount Kailash. A number of localities named after Bagh in Afghanistan, like Baglan, Bagram. Baghdad is located on river Tigris, which also means Bagh in Bengali. Koch or the turtle fraternity migration path can be established from Bengal and Assam along river Jamuna of Bangladesh to reach Kailash. Incidentally, turtle is the Vahan of Jamuna, suggesting its migration along the river. As one descends along Indus from Kailash, one reaches Kutch of Gujarat and Kutchi district of Balochistan. Following the Persian Gulf, one reaches the territory of Kassites in Mesopotamia, and finally the Koch fraternity emerges as Kushites in the Horn of Africa. It is possible that the Caspian Sea and Caucasus Mountains were so named as they were Koch fraternity settlements. It is likely that a matriarchal culture evolved on the Bengal coast at a very early date. During this period, goddesses became popular. Kali is known as Adi Shakti or primordial energy. It is likely that goddesses like Kali, Durga, Lakshmi, Saraswati, Manasha, which are extremely popular in Bengal, emerged during a matriarchal period when women were considered as the depository of knowledge, wealth, and power. As the matriarchal community spread to Egypt, we find emergence of goddesses like Nat, Hathor, and Isis in Egypt. Lieutenant Wilford, a British officer, wrote an article in the Asiatic Researches in 1794 where he established that the Nile River was known as the Kali River, and this is mentioned in the Padma Puran and Skanda Puran. Similarly, in Greece, Athena was very popular at the early stage of the establishment of European civilization. Athens, the ancient city of Greece, derived its name from Athena, like Kolkata deriving its name from Kali. The Sphinx of Alexandria in Egypt guarding Pompeii's pillar complex appeared to me very similar to Durga, who is inseparably associated with the lion. In fact, Lieutenant Wilford mentioned in his article that the Sphinx name originated from the word Singhi, meaning Singho-like or associated with lion. I was overjoyed to read that Sphinx was associated with the word Shingho. Shingho is a typical Bengali word meaning lion. I was equally thrilled when I went to the Philae temple in Aswan in Egypt. I found typical brachycephalic faces and slanting eyes of Isis created on the temple pillars, remarkably similar to the faces of the deities of Bengal. On top of almost every pillar, lotus images have been sculpted, when lotus is not a natural flower of Egypt. Moreover, Isis is shown with a yellow complexion, very similar to Lakshmi or Sri of Bengal. At the entrance of the Edfu temple, a large image of falcon is bound to attract the attention of Indians. This mythical eagle is the associate of Horus in Egypt. Our Hori or Vishnu also has a strikingly similar mythical eagle, popularly known as Goru, as his Vahan. I wonder if Hori has manifested as Horus in Egypt, Ashur manifesting as Osiris, and Sri as Isis. Interestingly, like our Ashur, Osiris is also green complexioned, a rather unusual color of the skin. The relative position of Nut and Jeb, two early deities of the Egyptian pantheon, appear to have a similarity with the composite image of Kali and Shiva of Bengal. Here, the deity Nut is placed over her consort Jeb, who lies on the ground like Shiva in Bengal. The names Jeb and Shiv are phonetically quite similar. Moreover, Nut is studded with stars, and one of the manifestations of Kali is Tara, meaning stars. Kali is associated with the crematorium in India and Nut with the burial sites in Egypt. Interestingly, Nut and Jeb have two sons and two daughters, very similar to Shiva and Durga of Bengal. In the second half of my book, I have discussed the evidences of reverse migration of the Indian origin fraternities from Egypt by different routes in different periods. The land route reverse migration took place along the Uttarapath and the Indus Valley civilization. We find the emergence of the reverse migration animal symbols like the lion, horse, boar, and peacock along the Uttarapath. They are found all over the subcontinent, especially in the Indian Himalayas, Nepal, Bhutan, Tibetan Plateau, Bengal, and Northeast India. A number of evidences identify the onward and reverse migration routes. I have seen two owners of a shop in Pokhara, Nepal. One was short with brachycephalic features, which is a typical feature of indigenous Indians, while the other was not only tall but had oligocephalic face, which is a typical feature of some regions of Europe. I've also seen Kali in Kamalasagar temple of Tripura draped in a white sari, suggesting her reverse migration nature. Over a period, the sea route reverse migration from the Red Sea region got established and extended to the Bay of Bengal as they were keen to reach the matriarchal territories of Ganga region. The Prakrita-speaking fraternities returned back to Bengal at this stage. As the Bengali-speaking reverse migration fraternities settled in Bangladesh, their Bengali dialects were different. I realized that the reverse migration fraternities had settled in the Northeast India since a very early period. During the land route migration period, they had come through Uttarapath along river Brahmaputra from Kailash. Many of them had settled in the higher reaches of the Himalayas, like Monpas of Tawang, while some others descended to the Brahmaputra Valley. The reverse migration fraternities from the Red Sea arrived later who settled in the region using two different routes. One fraternity from the Bay of Bengal ascended along the rivers of Bangladesh to settle in Assam and Tripura. Thus, we find ancient Greek art, popularly known as Hellenistic art, in the 6th century Dahaparvatiya temple of Tejpur. In Koilashahar, Tripura, we find unusual huge rock-cut images of Shiva in the Unakoti complex. The other group entered the Northeast Indian states from the east as they ascended along the river Iravati and Chilvi. The Ahoms reached along this route in the 13th century. The ancestral memorial of Ahoms in Choraidao are known as Maidems, which are miniature replica of the pyramids of Egypt. In fact, the oldest Egyptian pyramids were also known as Maidems. The Hebrew name of Egypt is Mirzaim. Mizos had been given visa by Israel as they were considered to be one of the lost tribes of Israel. One of the oldest Egyptian documents, Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, compiled at the beginning of the Christian era, mentions about the connectivity of the Red Sea and this region. There is a need to arrange the pre-recorded period of India based on available ground evidences. In that direction, I intend to start a discussion on several issues which need serious attention.
At this juncture, we have to concentrate on the east coast of India, its unique physical feature, as well as what happened in this region during the last glacial period. So that is very a key locality where post-glacial period genetic identities originated. And once we establish this, that the post-glacial period genetic identities originated here because the evidences suggest so, then it becomes the rest of the world, that is the modern civilization, it will become much easier for us to establish that the modern civilization got, where the outcome of the people who migrated from here. Now I'll show you another short video regarding the events which took place in this region during the last glacial period.
Several ethnic fraternities adopted various animal symbols, and as they migrated from the east coast, they spread Indian languages to those distant lands. What was so special about the east coast of India, where all these ethnic fraternities developed? Is it possible that newer AMH fraternities like R1 alpha and R1 Bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome originated in this region? Unless we are able to establish the unique nature of the Bengal-Myanmar coast to justify the origin of these newer genetic identities, the discussion regarding migration of various ethnic fraternities from the east coast becomes baseless, and also the spread of Indian languages. Interestingly, R1 alpha haplogroup in Y chromosome genetic identity is found in the entire Indo-European language-speaking territory, extending from eastern India to western Europe. Thus, this entire territory is clearly linguistically and genetically continuous. Europe also has high percentage of R1 Bravo haplogroup in Y chromosome genetic identity. These genetic identities found in various other regions of Asia, including India and Mesopotamia, and also in the Afro-Asian speaking Central Africa. Interestingly, an isolated pocket of this genetic identity is found on the east coast of India, which has not received the required attention so far. These isolated pockets need to be included while charting the early migration path of the fraternity. In fact, these isolated pockets could be their oldest settlements. Presently, it is believed that R1 alpha and R1 Bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome both originated in Eastern Europe near the European steppe and Anatolia region. However, many scholars consider that the origin of R1 alpha in South Asia cannot be ruled out. In fact, Underhill, who conducted a widespread genetic analysis of the Indo-European speaking territory, marked a region near Gujarat as having the oldest R1 alpha and several Himalayan pockets where the concentration of R1 alpha is extremely high. This itself clashes with the hypothesis of European steppe as the site of origin of R1 alpha. A number of Aboriginal tribes live in the Andaman archipelago. However, there is very little discussion about who were these people, when and how did they reach there. The only possible explanation is that they walked into the Andaman archipelago from the Bengal-Myanmar coast when a land bridge formed. During the glacial maximum, the sea level subsides by about 400 feet or 130 meters, and the Bengal coastline recedes, connecting Andamans with the mainland. During glacial period, for several thousand years, a huge coastal landmass surfaces between the Bengal and Myanmar coast, which is referred to as the Bengal Glacial Coastal Shelf in May's book. At this time, the population of two distinct genetic territories, the east coast of India and Southeast Asia, intermix. And this genetic union produces new genetic identities like R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome. As the seawater gradually rises during the interglacial period, this coastal landmass submerges, displacing the settled population. They settled on the Bengal coast and adopted various animal symbols as their ethnic identity. To begin with, they were bare-bodied and were known as Nanga, who adopted the Naga or serpent as their ethnic symbol. It is possible that their mother goddess was Kali, who is also depicted bare-bodied. These early fraternities eventually migrated following the Trans-Himalayan migration routes devoting Mount Kailash. The Indus Valley civilization emerged on this route. They continued their journey and established the Egyptian and Greek civilizations. It is extremely crucial to establish the site of origin of R1 alpha and R1 bravo haplogroups in Y chromosome on the east coast of India 10,000 years ago, because that will provide us the direction of the migration of the post-glacial period AMH fraternities and also the reason for the spread of Indian language and culture. About 10,000 years ago, R1 bravo haplogroup in Y chromosome migrated to Africa, establishing the Egyptian civilization and spreading Pali language in the Mediterranean region. Similarly, about 5,800 years ago, R1 alpha haplogroup in Y chromosome migrated to Eastern Europe along with the spoken Sanskrit language.
As I mentioned, that this region, we have to understand the events of this region during what happened during the last glacial period. We have pre-glacial period genetic identities, Jarawa, Onge, Centenaries, and Great Andaman is here. So this is the likely region where the post-glacial period genetic identities like R1 alpha, R1 bravo, and O haplogroup should have must originate, because there has to be a continuity. And the post-glacial period genetic identities can originate only at a place where pre-glacial period genetic identities live. A child can be born only at a place where their parents lived. Now, when this landmass submerged, obviously, then they got displaced, the settled population got displaced and they came to mainland and in the Bengal region. And that is why we find all three post-glacial period, primary three post-glacial period genetic identities like R1 alpha, R1 bravo, and O haplogroup present in Bengal region. And a section of them, these post-glacial period genetic identities, migrated to distant lands. Now, these fraternities which migrated, they belong to a mixed fraternity. Those who originated in the coastal region, they adopted, each fraternity adopted an animal symbol as their ethnic identity. Those which originated on the coastal region adopted coastal species like fish, turtle, swan, or goose, and naga as their ethnic identity. And those which originated inside the forest and preferred a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, they adopted bag, or tiger, Hanuman, hathi, and owl and naga as their ethnic identity. Now, wherever they actually settle in distant world, they name those territories after the animal symbol, like Bagdogra, Baghdad, Baglung Kali Temple, or Bagmati River, Baghdad in Mesopotamia, Tigris River, and then Hatti fraternity established their settlement in Turkey or Hittite Empire region. Their kingdom was known as Hatti and Hattusa. And then in the Pali-speaking territory, when the Hatti fraternity settled, they named their territory as Gojo, which is now known as Gaza Strip and Giza of Egypt. And similarly, the king's name were related with like Hatti Suli. The Hatti fraternity king was named Hatti Suli. Ram fraternity king was known as Rameses. And then even the empire, Hittite empire, possibly the Hatti fraternity empire, like that. I have actually arranged all these animal symbols in a flow chart. This was never attempted before. In fact, even now in Google Encyclopedia, there is no concept of animal symbol as a study subject, but I'm sure Once once the global population understands the implication of these animal symbols, this will become a very major and interesting subject for study. And these animal symbols, many of them originated in India. And when during the matriarchal period, they used cow as the animal symbol and along with Parvati. And then during the patriarchal period, they used bull as the animal symbol, as the bull and associated with the patriarchal god Shiva. And then when they went from India during their onward migration, they used tiger as an animal symbol, whereas during their stay in Western Asia and Africa for several thousand years, their characteristic changed. They adopted a new animal symbol, that is lion. And during reverse migration, they used lion animal symbol. And that is why with Durga, we find both tiger and lion associated. Now, this animal symbol will provide us the migration path and the direction and where all they reached at different period. Now, let us make an attempt to arrange the migration path of R1 Bravo from east coast of India to Central Africa and to Western Europe. So it is possible to arrange I mean establish the migration path when we consider that the majority of the migration took place along the Himalayan rivers and pivoting Mount Kailash to routes separated. Now, when we see this genetic distribution map, we find more or less similar pockets. Now, where we find this, the pockets of R1 Bravo even present even today, once we link those spots, we get the migration path. That is, West Bengal has 6.5% R1 Bravo, Punjabis have 7.6%, Pathan have 9.5%, Pakistani Hazara 32%, Baloch 8%, and when we connect all these, when we collect these pockets where R1 Bravo is present even today, we find the migration path. And as I mentioned, that even when they reached the Eastern world, let us say the Indian community reached Egypt, they named the river. Nile River was known as Kali River, and this has been established by a British scholar. Actually, when the British had come in 1794 to 1800, at that time they were aware that the civilization had spread from India, so their studies were in that direction. After Macaulay's visit, their attitude changed because possibly they realized that if they say that the civilization had spread from India, then it would have become very difficult for them to rule India. Then my observation is probably Kali manifested in Athens or in Greece and ancient Greek as Black Athena and in the rest of Europe as Black Madonna. It is intriguing that why a fair complexion community would worship a dark complexion deity. Possibly when the Greeks arrived in Greece, reached Greece several thousand years ago, they were also dark complexion. So they worshipped a dark complexion deity, that is Black Athena. You can see that Black Athena is also associated with Naga and owl symbol. And then over a period of time, because less exposure to sunlight, their depigmentation took place and they became more and more fair. And thus, at a later date, they preferred to have Athena as fair complexion Athena. And even in India also more or less similar to a change took place. That is, Kali became Durga. That is a warrior goddess Durga. Even Athena is also a warrior goddess. There is a lot of similarity between the transformation of Kali to Durga and transformation of Black Athena to Athena. Then comes the period of reverse migration. Over a period of time or at a later date, Indian origin fraternities preferred to come back to India for various reasons. First reason was when the patriarchal culture emerged particularly in Egypt, Western Asia, and Europe, the matriarchal community there felt uncomfortable and they returned to India. And there are other reasons. That is, when Christianity emerged, Indian origin people following the Indian culture were considered as pagan culture and they were hated and they were discriminated, and those community again preferred to come back to India. And finally, when the Islam emerged there, another group of Indian origin fraternity practicing Hinduism preferred to come back to India. Now, initially, this is when they were coming back by land route. Mostly, they were traveling through Indus Valley civilization and Uttarapat. Whereas at a later date, they came back by sea route. And at that time, the sea route got extended to not only to Bay of Bengal, even to Northeast India. And there is an interesting map here that is when the reverse migration Pali-speaking fraternity were coming back. Now, when the Indian origin Pali-speaking fraternity settled there, they named their settlement as Palistan, which has now become Palestine. And this Pali-speaking fraternity, when they returned by sea route on the west coast of India and then spread in the central and northern India, they established 16 Mahajanapadas. These are recorded in Pali language written books of Jain and Buddhist scriptures. And that confirms that they were all Pali-speaking settlements, Pali-speaking settlement, and they arrived much before then, before the Sanskrit-speaking fraternity arrived. And actually, these people arrived at least much prior to 6th century BC, because these records of in Pali script and Pali language and in Jain and Buddhist scriptures were written in 6th century BC. And Buddha generally traveled in these Mahajanapadas. And at a later date, Sanskrit-speaking fraternity returned from Eastern Europe, and they, at a later date, of course, dominated. And here also, we can see that Indian origin fraternities with their language and culture managed to settle in distant lands for a very long period, and they continued to speak in their own language, and those languages continued there till the Indian origin people en masse returned to India with their to settle back in India. These Indian origin languages were much more popular there. I'm reading a book called India in Greece, where the author, E. Pocock, is establishing that ancient language of Greece was actually Pelasgian, or possibly he meant the Pali language. Now, it is also extremely difficult to convince the global community that Indian origin people had traveled and established other ancient civilizations unless we manage to establish it with the available genetic data. So we have to establish that with genetic data. And then what should we do now? How do we convince? We have to show the global community about the ground evidences which we have, and the scientific explanation of those evidences. Like we definitely have pre-glacial period genetic identities in Andaman Archipelago. That is the Jarvas, Onges, Sentinelese. They can come and see that Jarvas, Onges, Sentinelese, and Great Andamanis are still there, and they are nothing but pre-glacial period genetic identities. And then when we arrange their migration path, we have to think about glacial and interglacial period and rising and lowering of the sea level and formation of the Bengal glacial coastal shelf. Not only formation, we have to discuss about the submersion of this Bengal glacial coastal shelf resulting in migration of the population settled there. And finally, we have to establish that Bengal glacial coastal shelf is the most suitable place where the post-glacial period genetic identities like R1 alpha, R1 bravo, and O haplogroup would have originated, and they got displaced as the at the onset of the interglacial period, because they are settled. That land was submerged. Once we manage to establish this, then the world civilization would belong to Indian origin people. And then comes another issue, that is animal symbols was the brainchild of the Indian origin people, and they spread all over the world, and we find them, but the origin is from Bengal, Indian region. And finally, we had the stones cutting skill. We see that in all the ancient civilizations, we find all the major structures are actually built of stone cut. They are made of huge stone blocks. And in India, we can see that majority of the temples till very recent time were constructed with stone, suggesting that Indian population had very refined skill regarding stone cutting and transporting huge stone blocks from place A to place B. In fact, Kailash Temple of Ellora is possibly the most complex man-made stone cut structure in the world. And then we introduced a color code, that is different color we have to use because the reverse migration fraternities were coming back from different directions. Indian origin people use different color. That is why our deities also have different complexion. And those who came back from Egypt were given red color, and that is why their sea is known as Red Sea. And those who came back from Europe were identified by white color, and those who came back from Persia were identified with green color. And black, blue, and yellow possibly belong to Indian origin people of different period. And then terracotta. We find terracotta in almost every ancient civilization, and terracotta is still a living art in India. So even terracotta spread from India. And finally, Pali and Sanskrit languages were, these are where the languages spread from India, and they travel along with different genetic identities. And from Sanskrit, possibly Indo-European language developed, and that branch developed. And similarly from Pali, possibly the languages of Arabic as well as Semitic languages. I don't know, I'm not a linguist, but it appears that Pali speakers reached and Pali language spread in the Mediterranean region, Egypt and Greece at a very early stage, and possibly all other languages of that region at the present time must have been the descendants of Pali. It is possible to establish the reverse migration of the Indian origin fraternities from Egypt and Europe back to India. And finally, this Ganga Riddhi. There is a lot of record about Ganga Riddhi in the Western layer, Greek, Roman, and Egyptian record, whereas we don't discuss that much. So we have to include the historical records about India, which is present in the Western world. Once we establish that, it will automatically establish that knowledge of other subjects like astronomy, astrology, mathematics, philosophy, medicine, metallurgy, everything went from India. We suspect this knowledge transfer, but from India to the West, but fail to establish them convincingly. Now, we have to fall upon this genetic data. We can see that, as I mentioned, that it is easily available, and these genetic data maps have been created by the Western scholars, and we can still see a territory of R1 Bravo concentration in east coast of India, exactly where they would have settled following the submersion of the Bengal-Myanmar coast region. And nobody is discussing this. It is very surprising that when any data is there in our favor, there is little discussion about that in the global community. And as there is no other footmarks around that region, it is unlikely that this pocket has come at a later date. And when the genetic pocket is present, it has to be included in the migration part. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Tilak ji. That was a wonderful presentation. It was full of information and knowledge. Now we will open the floor for questions. So please raise your hand and then I will unmute people individually. You can also ask your question in the chat window if you want to. Vivek ji, please go ahead.
Namaste, Dr. Saab.
Namaste.
We have met in the IHR live conference in the IIT Delhi, along with the Dr. Surbhutto Gangopadhyay ji.
Yes,
because I worked as a secretary of the IHR.
Okay,
Advocate.
okay. Nice
so
to
yes, there I met you, and that example of the Bagh Dogra to Baghdad was always remembered by me. That how the river was coined as the term Tigris. So, what are the other places? Because you have talked about the Mitra also. Mitra surname. You have talked about the symbols of the animals, but you also talk about the surnames also.
Yes.
If you remember.
Yes.
So, what is that? Because I lost that point. So, I just want to understand that there is a Lord Mitra, a Mitra, and is also common in the Persian also. So, the god is also used to be common between the civilization.
Yes, of course. Actually, if you see, Mitra is one of the deity of the Rig Veda. You know, Borun and Mitra, all these are deities of Rig Veda. So Mitra was a community I personally think in Bengal there are surnames like Bag, Nag, Ghotok. Ghotok is Ghoda, and then Hathi. These are common surnames. Whereas in Indian territory we find Singh is a very common. I personally think that is they were the descendant of the Singho fraternity, and then that Singho is spelled in a different manner. In some region it is said, I mean, it is pronounced as Sinha, and in some region in Manipur it is Singho, and in other places it is Singh. So definitely many of the surnames, not all, some of the surnames are based on your profession, and some of the surnames are I mean, I'm not going into all the surnames, but there are surnames which probably suggest that they were the descendant of a particular fraternity. And
Okay.
I will discuss that further in some of the book where we can actually include many such names, many such surnames which actually, like Mishra, a surname with Mishra, which is Egypt was known as Misro Desh because it had multiple ethnic fraternities. Egypt was if you go there, you will find all these animal symbols together. So I think even now also Mishor, it is known as Mishor. Even Arabian people call that as Mishor. Mishor, I think it is because of that it was a Misro Desh. And then in India, we find Mishra as a very common surname. These are my observations, but I can't really confirm that. Like even for that matter, Gupta. Egypt was known as Gupta Desh because it was Indian people were traveling to Egypt, but the migration path was so circuitous that they could not understand where is that country. So that Egypt was known as Gupta Desh, and then we find Guptas ruling India, and we find lot of Guptas brought a lot of skill, a lot of I personally feel that they had actually come from Egypt. I mean, Red Sea region. Similarly, even Maurya's. There's a place called Mero. I've explained all these things in the book. Many other things which we could not really discuss here. So many such connecting are there, which we are not really seriously thinking. But when we compile all those elements together, then it appears like all the deities. You can't imagine how many Rig Vedic deities are there. That Surya is there, Varun is there in a very blatant form. And with the same animal symbol, the catch is with the same animal symbol. Like as I mentioned, that Hori in India is associated with Gorud. And in there you find Horus is associated with falcon, which is nothing but a mythical eagle. So there are a lot of things which are very strikingly similar, but I don't know whether it was ever attempted, but I found them and compiled them in that book. And then now I am writing about Greece, even Greece, Turkey. I found much more evidence in these regions, but they are in scattered form. So I thought Egyptians, it is easy to handle Egypt first because the entire Egyptian civilization is along Nile River. So if you travel from one place to the other with limited budget, I could travel from one place to the, I mean, from Abu Simbel to Alexandria and covered Egyptian, whatever is there, because entire Egyptian civilization is along the river Nile. So it was much easier to really understand what is there in that civilization.
Thank you,
And
sir.
now
Arvindji,
I
please go
the
ahead.
rest of Mediterranean region, that is Turkey, Greece, Israel, Jordan, all these regions. Yes.
Thank you so much, Prashad ji, and thank you so much, Dr. Bera, for excellent session, very enlightening. My only comment is that, what we are fighting, unfortunately, is the willful blindness, as you rightly said towards the end, that we need to convince the word fraternity and any data in our favor is really discussed in the international community. So this is what we need to highlight. So my question is, what efforts are being made to influence the international community to see our data and our claims more favorably?
If you are asking me, as an individual, whatever I'm doing, I'm a retired defense officer with entire of my pension budget. I'm doing this. So that is at individual level. But unfortunately, the institutional approach, all of us are working in our own. I mean, we are following a particular approach. I don't know which approach is the most, and the best approach. It's very difficult to exactly pinpoint that. But I'm wherever I'm going, like I just went to Göbekli Tepe. I found exactly what I was searching is there. And Göbekli Tepe is 12,000-year-old settlement. Now, I don't know. We have to spread. It is your responsibility now. How do we spread it further? How do we get connected with the academic institutes? I want to face them. It is not that what I'm saying, I'm saying like this genetic data also. It is not that we are, I'm discussing from my own. I have discussed this with some of the geneticists who are, let us say, some of them are genetics, I mean, in charge of genetics of anthropological survey of India, Dr. Vishwanath Sarkar. So he has said that nowhere I have mentioned anything which is not compatible with the available genetic data. Now, we have to now give this idea that whether the global community or even our geneticists are willing to think in this direction. If it gets stuck, that is, if the available genetic data says, no, it is not possible, then we have to accept. But otherwise, maybe they have never thought in this line before. I don't know why this Andaman population is not included in many of our talks. And as I discussed, it is not actually, why should I introduce a subject, how Andaman got connected with mainland? It should have been there in many of our subject syllabus. That yes, Andaman gets, after all, Andaman tribes are Indian population. And we have to explain how did they reach there? Now, there is absolute silence about these subjects which are little understood. Okay, fine. You don't understand, but what is the harm in thinking about it? You make it open that what are the different approach, and then I am giving yeah. And then as I told you, there are many evidences which are scattered and not there in the library material. I am taking the pain of going to every place and collecting those here, and now I'm providing that on the library. That is all as an individual I can do. I'm writing books after books to make all these data available in the library. Of course, it is not possible for everybody to visit Northeast India, oblique entire Indian subcontinent. Neither it is possible for Indians to visit every territory of Mediterranean region, oblique Red Sea region. So I'm doing that. I'm doing with my limited resource and making all this data available to the library, in the library material, at least in the book form. And then it has to spread to the academic forums, and they have to think that whether it is acceptable or not. I'm ready to face any question by any authority. I mean, any yeah. So let us see how much how far we can go in this manner.
Thank you, sir.
And I don't know when and national oblique international community will form who will work on this. Actually, IHAR, as he mentioned, IHAR is doing a very good job in that Indian Historical Awareness and Research. Subrato is doing very good work from Texas. I mean, Houston, I think, from Houston. And they are conducting many seminars. They are conducting many conferences. And in fact, the conference he mentioned, I've given a lecture in IIT Delhi in Bharatvarsha, the Cradle of Civilization. That was a 3-day international conference there. There I had given that what are the evidences of onward and reverse migration of the Indian Aryan fraternities. Here we have touched upon that subject, but that was not the main focus. Of course, we have to understand that there are lots of evidence of reverse migration. Unfortunately, a reverse migration from Europe is still considered, but reverse migration from Egypt is completely ignored. And nobody talks about reverse migration from Egypt, whereas the evidences are there.
Please go ahead, Indic studies.
Namaste, Tilakji. Quick question. So we have this great big histories written in our tradition, Ramayana, Mahabharata, Ramayana, and also going backwards, also the Dasharatha Yajna war. in the Rigved Mandala 10. So do you find in your studies and your reading any evidence of these three big wars that happened in Bharat and related to Egypt? Anything? Because a lot of population got migrated westwards during that time. This was last 10,000 years. It's not even going back before that. Any references in the Egyptian literature to this?
See, those people who are studying only this, they can say that. But for me, I have understood why this. What was the event of Mahabharata? Obviously, when we are going back into the pre-recorded period, and definitely these two epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata, are not entirely imaginary. There is no doubt about it. That there is a lot of hearsay element, oblique, some sort of those events must have taken place. Now, what I feel is actually both these events were the conflicts which occurred. You have noticed that Sanskrit speaking, I have mentioned, but because this is a big issue, I tried to avoid. Sanskrit speaking fraternities actually came from European territory, and through Kailash they entered from that direction. And the Pali-speaking fraternities came from, let us say, Red Sea region and Mediterranean region, and they entered through Northeast India. There were a lot of conflict between Sanskrit and Pali speakers. In the literature also, you will find what these people are saying they are ignoring and what. In fact, Buddhism was not written, as you can note. I mean, you have to accept that the philosophy of Buddhism, Shunyata and emptiness, is the most refined philosophical discussion which took place in 5th century, 6th century BC, 526, 23 BC. That is completely ignored by the Sanskrit speakers.
Sorry, Tilakji. My question is not just very straight question. Are these three wars? I know it's history. It's not imaginary. That we have established already. Is there any impact on this Egyptian migration? That was my question. Is there any reference? That's it.
No reference. I have not found any reference as such, because these events are occurring during pre-script period. We have to imagine a lot of things on the basis of, like, why Ashura is settling in Sri Lanka. That is there. So that's a reverse migration path from Egypt. So these conflicts were possibly two fraternities which have come back to India. They were having these conflicts. You can see even in the Mahabharata also, Kauravas are behaving in a different manner and Pandavas are behaving in a different manner. Culturally, though they were related, related in the sense that some ethnic connectivity were, but the cultural characteristics were quite different. So I personally feel that these are the outcome of two reverse migration fraternities coming from two different cultures who were born and brought up in different environment and different culture. So that is what I can say at this stage. So by this onward reverse migration is, we can explain, like, for example, even in Ramayana also. Anyway, we will not go into that details because that's a very complex game. Because when you consider Ramayana, as Hanuman followed everything, that is, they behaved like a human being otherwise, and his entire army, then it becomes very difficult to scientifically accept. But when you consider that they were the Hanuman fraternity who used Hanuman symbol as their ethnic identity, and they were nothing but a human fraternity, then it becomes much more acceptable, And the moment you say, no, they actually were that species, but they behaved like human beings, then it becomes a fantasy. I mean, it becomes difficult to scientifically accept.
Thank you, Tilakji. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Ji, looks like there's no more questions, so we will conclude our session. Thank you so much it was full of new information, and it's a different perspective on Egypt and India. And thank you, audience, for attending this session. We will meet again in our next presentation. Dhanyavad, everyone.
Namaskar. Thank you.